Yes.
Hi guys, my name's Sandra,
My name's Richard.
and our theory is the gender and queer.
This is our poem, The Distant Moon, by Rafael Campo. Admitted to the hospital again, the second bout of pneumonitis back in January almost killed him. Then, he sworn says he died at home. He baked his cookies, which his students wouldn't eat. Before he left, the kitchen on 5A is small, but serviceable and neat. He told me stories. Richard Gere was gay and sleeping with a friend of his, and AIDS was an elaborate conspiracy. Affected by the government, he stayed 4 months. He lost his sight to CMV. One day, I drew his blood, and while I did, he laughed, and I said I was his girlfriend now. His blood brother, vampire slut, he cried. You'll make me live forever. Wrinkled brows were all I managed in reply. I know I'm drowning in his blood, his purple blood. I filled my 7 tubes. The warmth was slow to leave them. Pressed inside my poem, I'm sad because he doesn't see my face, because I can't identify with him. I hate the fact that he's my age and that across my skin he's there, my blood brother, my mate. He said I was too nice, and after all, if Jodie Foster was a lesbian, then doctors could be queer. Residual. Guilt tingled down my spine. Okay, I'm done, I said as I withdrew the needle from his back and pressed the CSF was clear. I never answered him. That spot was framed in sterile paper drapes. He was so near death, telling him seemed pointless. Then he died. Unrecognizable to anyone but me, he left my needles deep inside his choking heart, and autopsy was done. I'd read some at night, his horoscope, the New York Times, the Advocate. Some lines by Richard Howard gave us hope. A quiet hospital was infinite. The polished ice-white floors, the darkened halls that led to almost anywhere, to death, or ghostly lighted coke machines. I called to him one night at home, asleep. His breath, I dreamed, it filled my lungs. His lips, my lips, had touched. I felt as though I touched his shrine, not disrespectfully, but in some lapse of concentration, in a mirror shines.
Okay, for the distant moon and the gender and queer theory, what we're looking for are terms that help us understand, terms that will help us relate to gender and queer. For example, AIDS. We know that back in the 1980s, 1970s, AIDS, there was an epidemic of AIDS, and it was mostly connected back to the gay and lesbian community. So we see AIDS here, we see CMV, which means herpes, and we see pneumocystis back, which means pneumonia, and it mostly affects patients with AIDS. So we know that the story is told by the doctor or nurse's point of view because he talks about the patient being admitted to the hospital again. And it says here in January it almost killed him. So it's a guy, the patient is a guy. And he talks about how he told him stories about Richard Gere was gay and sleeping with a friend of his and AIDS. And it says here was an elaborate conspiracy in which this proves what I just said about AIDS. How his friend had AIDS and it was a conspiracy because that's what they thought all gay people used to have back in the days. Okay, so the second stanza talks about the action of him drawing the patient's blood and the bond that they make. So he says, I drew his blood. And he mentions that the patient jokes around about him being his girlfriend and then goes on and calls him his blood brother. So right away, you're confused about whether the nurse is a girl or a guy. But it's a guy because he says my blood brother. That's not something that you say to a girl. And so they joke around, calling each other vampire slut and joking around that the nurse will make him live forever. So the doctor mentions drowning his blood, so that means, because he's drawing his blood. And then he says, my purple blood, which is infected blood because he has AIDS. And we know from the first paragraph that he has CMV, which is herpes that affects his eyes. So he's blind. The patient is blind because the herpes, the virus, affected his eyesight. And right here, he talks about the patient not being able to see his face. and then says that he can't identify with him, meaning that the doctor has an issue with identity and sexuality, which goes back to the gender and queer theory, which mentions that, you know, queer people or people that have problem with identity, they don't really follow the same rules and applications as, you know, a normal person with, you know, man or woman. So yes, and then he goes on and says, you know, my skin, he's there, my blood brother, my mate, saying that they're both guys. My skin, he's there, my blood brother, because he has AIDS, and gay people back in the day were they were stereotyped as, you know, being infected and carrying AIDS with them, just because a lot of people weren't normalized with the idea of having gay people in society. That's when he says, my blood brother, my mate. Okay, so the third paragraph starts here, and he mentions Jodie Foster, who is a famous director, and she is a lesbian. So he says, if Jodie Foster was a lesbian, then doctors could be queer, which basically means that he's justifying that he's queer. So he's saying if Jodie Foster, a famous person, is queer, then doctors could be queer as well, that there's no problem with him being queer. So he says, guilt stinging on my spine, which basically means that he's questioning himself, that he feels guilty for being queer, that he's still not sure of it. He's just a confused person, which is perfectly normal in the gender and queer theory. In this paragraph, he just talks about his CSF, which is a test done in the brain and the spine for fluid. And he says, I never answered him. Death, he was so near death, telling him seemed pointless. Basically, he means that the doctor knew he was going to die. And so when he does die, then he died, he mentions unrecognizable to anyone. But he left my needles deep inside his choking heart, and autopsy was done. So basically what he's trying to say is that they built such a strong bond that when he died, you know, all the tests that they ran with the blood drawing and the CSF, it meant something to him. And it meant something to him when trying to find his identity. Okay, so the last paragraph sums up his feelings for the patient. He's going back he's going back into his memories and remembering how important this patient was to him. He talks about how he'd read to him his horoscope, and he goes into very specific details. New York Times, lines by Richard Howard, and how they gave him hope. So he's really feeling the loss of the patient, because then he goes on with using imagery of the halls, ice, white floors, and darkened halls, which basically just they symbolized the sadness and the loss, and how important and how hurt he is that the patient actually died, even though he knew that he was going to die. So right here he says, I called to him one night at home, asleep. So he's dreaming of him. He's going back into his memory for him. His breath, I dreamt, had filled my lungs. His lips, my lips had touched. So he dreamt that they kissed. My lips had touched. I felt as though I touched a shrine. I touch a shrine, which basically means that him kissing him feels right. It's somewhere that he belongs. And not disrespectfully, but in some lapse of concentration, in mirror shines. So this story, The Distant Moon, relates to the gender and queer theory because it talks about a doctor who is confused. He considered himself queer. We see that on the third paragraph when he says, then doctors could be queer, and guilt tinkled down my spine. He was confused, and he wasn't sure, if he was ready to admit it, until he meets a patient that really meets all the requirements of a gay person. He has AIDS. He talks about his friends being gay and sleeping with guys with AIDS. And he compares to him as his blood brother, my mate, my skin, he's there, because they're both guys. And he ends up being intimate with this patient, without even recognizing it. And after his death, he dreams about them kissing, and he dreams about them being together and feeling right. So he finally discovers himself after meeting the patient.